Dan Brown, the author of the Da Vinci Code, has yet to find a bit of history he cannot mangle. In Florence, for example, in the town hall, the Plaza Vecchio, there is a map room. And Dan's hero, played in film by Tom Hanks, uses a secret door behind one of the maps to find a passage that leads him out of the building just before the bad guys get there. And the door is there. But in reality, it leads to an outside porch on maybe the 4th floor to what would be a literal dead end, but not in the shape-shifting, albeit fun, world of Dan Brown. Grand assumptions, altered history, legends made into fact are all part of the storytelling, and one grand assumption is central to the Da Vinci Code. The idea that if Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene, he could not have been the Son of God. What is that about? Well, it comes from the idea that a physical human relationship, even within marriage, would not be worthy of the holy, even if the holy was in the person of one fully human and fully God. The idea that this kind of love would be dirty, and that Jesus would therefore be just another guy. Interestingly, Dan Brown never unpacks any of this in the book. It is just an assumed truth. But was this idea always assumed true? And if not, how did we get to the idea that the body is dirty and celibacy is a required state for holiness? Well, you gotta go back. First off, Jesus was Jewish. In Judaism, marriage was never seen as an impediment to holiness. Rabbis were married. Sons of rabbis often became rabbis. The wife of the rabbi had a special name for him, Rabboni, that Mary addresses Jesus with at the resurrection scene in John. Most scholars think, though, that Jesus was not married, and the reason, unless Jesus was simply following God's plan, is that he would not have been able to afford it. This was not, according to some scholars, that unusual. A man without a steady income could not afford marriage, which would definitely have had an effect on society, including creating a market for prostitution. But of course, the idea that Jesus was not married and that Paul was not married adds fodder to the idea that celibacy would be superior to marriage. And of course, Paul comes right out and says it. I wish that everyone was as I am, celibate, single, but each has his own gift from God, one this way, another that. Even Paul, who would run screaming, I believe, from a reading of Song of Solomon, Song of Songs, adds the caveat that celibacy is not for everyone. And pretty much all the apostles were married, including Peter. So what gives? It's a wild journey. The 2nd century was the time of Gnosticism, which, to greatly simplify, promoted the idea that things spiritual were good and the physical was bad. Ideas from Gnosticism, including the idea that celibacy was superior, leaked into the faith, but didn't really affect church leaders that much. They were still having families. It's really not until the 300s, when, by the way, Jewish influence in Christianity had begun to wane, that we start seeing a pro-priestly celibacy movement emerging. 303, the Council of Elvira, and no, the Oak Ridge Boys were not there, declares that a priest who sleeps with his wife the night before Mass will lose his job. So an idea is taking hold, right? Holiness means abstinence. And 20 years or so later, at the 325 Council of Nicaea, it's decreed that after ordination, a priest could not marry. So the idea gets a little stronger. You can get married, but only before you become a priest. Then in 352, at the Council of Laodicea, an amazing decision is made. Women are not to be ordained. Now, why would they need to say that? Recent archaeological findings regarding the earliest church suggest that women were ordained not just as deacons, but perhaps as more. So this is kind of an additional movement towards celibacy, male celibacy, as the great mark of holiness. By the way, the Orthodox priests can marry before ordination or choose celibacy. Only celibates can become bishops. And if you are a married male Lutheran pastor, like me, well, the Catholics and the Orthodox will take you on as a priest, even as they kick out their own for pursuing marriage after ordination. And no, I cannot explain that. Then in 385, Pope Celibacy, I think that's how you say his name, left his wife in order to become pope, and he decreed that priests may no longer sleep with their wives. You can have a wife, but... And all this leads to 401, when St. Augustine writes, "Nothing is so powerful in drawing the spirit of a man downward as the caresses of a woman." Yeah. By the way, before his conversion, Augustine was a player. But despite all this, most priests were still married, and the priesthood was often still a family business. Records show that in the 600s in France, the majority of priests were married. In the 700s, St. Boniface, one of several patron saints of brewmasters, reported to the Pope that in Germany, almost no bishop or priest was celibate. Obviously, in these times, decisions made in a city far, far away did not affect local churches much. Still, the movement for celibate priests spread even as it began to cause problems. In the 800s, a council admitted that heinous crimes were being committed in monasteries to hide the actions of priests who could not remain celibate, prompting St. Ulrich to proclaim that the church needed to allow priests to marry. And many still did, despite the efforts of the church. And finally, in 1095, Pope Urban II had the wives of priests sold into slavery, and their children were abandoned. And in 1123, Pope Callistus II decreed clerical marriages invalid. Yet, in the 1400s, 50% of priests were still married, but the change was on and solidly in place by the time of Luther. The desire for an elevated priesthood was linked to being set apart, and celibacy was seen as part of that, despite the problems, despite the disagreement, despite that in the time of Luther, the corruption of the church included brothels in Rome that only serviced clergy. The idea hung on, became entrenched, and is still being fought about today. In fact, most of the history I've just shared with you comes from a group called Future Church, a Catholic group that is fighting for the end of required priestly celibacy and for the ordination of women. In 1992, singer Sinead O'Connor pretty much ended her career by tearing a picture of the Pope in half on Saturday Night Live. John Paul was a popular pope. It made people mad. It made me mad. What I didn't get was she was protesting the abuse by priests of children in her country, a fact hidden by the church, a pattern of abuse worldwide that has even touched this congregation. While celibacy is indeed a gift some can embrace, requiring it is obviously fraught with problems. But why do we need to talk about it? We don't adhere to it. We don't see it as necessary for ministry. We don't look at the early church and feel called to it. We ordain women and any worthy candidate for ministry. Well, we need to talk about it because it has infected our world and our faith. The grand assumptions of Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code are the tip of the iceberg. In 1979, James Nelson wrote Embodiment, a book sadly only read by seminarians and the like, and he argues against the view that human sexuality is in any way dirty by promoting two important ideas. First, our bodies are a gift of God in God's image and our means of experiencing all things. Second, God chose to take on a physical body in Jesus for our salvation, which tells you the physical is holy. The rejection of the physical on the part of Christianity has caused too many guilt, depression, feelings of unworthiness. People are made to feel they are lesser because they have natural desires. Christians are given the message sometimes subtly, sometimes at volume 11, that they are evil because they cannot attain the fairy tale expectations of purity foisted upon them by the church. In this, the joy of how we've been created is taken away and replaced with a demand that we either live a lesser life or a life filled with guilt, a life most reject in one way or another because the faith it espouses is so out of touch with modern reality. The view that the body is bad has mostly robbed Christianity of its voice about the body in our culture. We have much to say that's good about healthy sexuality, but the idea that Christians think the body is bad is hard to fight, and it's reduced Christianity to mostly a silent actor on the stage. And I think this negative view is often the cause of a first part of rejection of faith for many. Our youth were reminded at the gathering that we are fearfully and wonderfully made. The joy of faith should include understanding God has created us good in all ways. Denying our humanity, as the church has learned, often leads to evil. And it leads to evil because most humans cannot live in a suppressive system for too long before illness and sometimes evil take root. We are created for joy. And celibacy indeed can be a joyful gift, but not for most. Jesus was not a body-denying avenger. Jesus loved food, he loved celebrations, he loved people, and healed their physical bodies as well as their souls. And what was he called? A glutton, a drunkard. What was he really? The bringer of the kingdom to earth, to people created in God's good image, reminding us God is here in the gift of our bodies and in human community. If you take anything away from here today, remember this. Human beings are the ones who call the body lesser, not God. God has created us, all of us, good. You are in God's image, and the image of God is seated all around you today. Live in that joy.